And is everyone able to see the slide on the screen? Fuad, can you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you so much for joining us to the first part of our book launch series. This has been in the making for a while. It takes quite some time to get a book published. So we've been working on this together for, I don't know, 2-3 years, something like that. And it's very exciting to finally see that this book is now published. It's already online. It will be published as a hard copy next week. And of course, we do not expect you to spend $110 on the book. You can contact any of us and ask for the chapters. And some of them are also posted on ResearchGate, and we'll share the links that we have for the author's chapters today in the session. So you see on this slide who will be presenting today. It's just a subset of the authors. And then part 2 will be on September 17th with another subset of authors, but not all of them. The topic, as you know, is the psychology of resistance in violent and repressive contexts, and we're hoping to expand how social psychology has been thinking about these issues, which leads us to the first question or part of this panel, which is just a very brief few words from co-editor Fuad Bouzainedine and myself, why we wanted to do this book and also why now, the relevance. I will say that obviously repression and resistance to repression and violence is always so-called timely. And, you know, whenever someone asks, what do you study? And I tell them and they say, oh, that's so timely. My response is always, when is it not? That being said, I would argue that at least in some parts of the world over the course of the last 2 years where we have been working on this book, repression of various social movements, including the Palestine Solidarity Movement most recently, and also the climate movement, has become so much more salient and visible, and the authorities have been ramping up their repression, it seems, on various fronts. So in a way, it seems timely to publish it now. That being said, it always has been timely in different parts of the world at different points of time. So why this book? And you know, why now I already maybe answered, but why this book? So Fuad and myself and many of the authors who contributed to the volume, I think, have been somewhat dissatisfied with the state of the, you know, how resistance is treated in social psychology. So we have a lot of theorizing and also empirical research on collective action in its most prototypical form, which would be street protests, overt, organized collective action, which, as we know, under repressive conditions is simply not always possible due to the repression. There has been also some really important work on collective action under repressive contexts, because, of course, despite repression, it still occurs, this overt street protest, although perhaps in different forms and for different reasons. So Arin Ayanyan, who's also a co-author, a contributor to this book, has been doing a lot of pioneering work. There's some earlier work by Rim Saab, Nicole Tausch, a few others. That being said, that body of work is fairly scarce compared to the work on collective action in less repressive contexts. We argue in the book it's a continuum. There's no society that does not repress collective action when it becomes too inconvenient or threatening to the authorities. So, you know, one goal was simply to expand this body of work on collective action in repressive contexts, but also go beyond the street protests and the prototypical forms of collective action in order to show the variety of different forms of resistance that will emerge and exist and coexist under repressive conditions, and especially perhaps under repressive conditions. And then a third point, I think, was also to broaden the geographical, regional, international scope of work in this area, because again, as anywhere in psychology, we tend to see you know, more work from the so-called Western I won't say democratic, but just Western countries and less work from other parts of the world. So another goal in this volume was to simply, bring in more context and enrich our theorizing in this way. And now I'll hand over to Fuad to add whatever I left out and additional motivations you had in wanting to create this book.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for being here again. So yeah, one of the goals for me with this book was to try, aside from the actual research, was to try and also foster links and generate dialogue and experiential and academic exchange between people who are not normally working together or aware of each other's work. Maybe they're working on different contexts or different time periods. Um, and also to just underscore the value to the research area and the discipline of these of some underrepresented voices and work in the so-called periphery. So that was one of really the main goals, and we tried to do this, by as Johanna mentioned, diversifying as much as possible the context that we were looking for contributions about. And in part, that's because we really thought it was important to try and triangulate what it is about context that influences the psychology of resistance. And you can't really do that if you don't have sufficient breadth and diversity, and don't include also fairly specifically different kinds of contexts where perhaps repression is long-standing, contexts where it's chronic, contexts where it flares up in unpredictable or predictable ways. How do these kinds of structural or large-scale differences in context manifest in differences in processes or in behaviors? I would add also, like Johanna was saying as well, that it's important not just for understanding what's going on in terms of protest, but also how people adapt to repression and violence. And we can't really do that unless we're looking at a broader range of behavioral and political activity that people engage in these settings where the protest can be more structurally constrained or repressed. And finally, I think an important goal for me was to try and emphasize with empirical evidence how resistance as a phenomenon is pervasive, varied in its forms and goals, and responsive and resilient to repressive tactics, and how it's situated in and inseparable from history, from politics, from social relations and interactions, as well as being informed by the kinds of things that we usually look at in psychology, like individual differences and psychological processes. So yeah, that's sort of a few random scattered thoughts about our motives behind this book. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, and the link to the book is here on the slide. We can also put it through the chat, perhaps, if you want to click on it. And just quickly on the scope and the contents of the book, as I said, today we only have authors from 5 of the chapters, but there are 16 chapters total, and you probably cannot read this on this very tiny screen, but again, we'll put the link to the book on the chat and you can look at the table of contents there. We have 3 sections in the book. The first one is about these more prototypical, commonly studied forms of street protest in violent and repressive contexts. The second one is about forms of resistance that go beyond protest and involve other forms of resistance, including everyday resistance. And Canan Choskan will talk about some of them today, and also Joshua Oyheng and Tina Montiel. And then in the third section, we have a variety of different topics looking at changes in tactics under different conditions, and a few other kind of specific angles in the context of repression. We have a variety of different, in addition to these different forms of resistance, we also have a variety of different contexts represented in the book. Today you will hear about Turkey, Sudan, the Philippines, Czechoslovakia. So we tried to make it, as diverse and broad as possible. That being said, there are some obvious gaps in our geographic scope that we also write about in our introduction and discussion, what is still missing in this representation. All right, so now we'll jump into the first brief presentation of one of the chapters, and just to briefly announce the structure of the session today. So we have 5 author teams. Each author team will take about 5 minutes to just briefly introduce really their chapter, not summarize, but introduce their chapter and highlight some of the main theoretical insights that the chapter presents. Whenever possible, we'll put a link through the chat to their chapter on ResearchGate. And of course, you're also welcome to contact the authors and ask them for their chapter if we don't have it. And after these 5 brief introductions of the chapter, we'll have a roundtable discussion going into questions about context, culture, and also what we may be able to generalize despite this context-sensitive, context-specific analysis of different cases of resistance, and how this can help enrich our theorizing about resistance if we want to move beyond the Simca model in social psychology and other more commonly studied theoretical frameworks. All right, so first we have Sigrun.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here. And thank you, Fuad and Johanna, for organizing this, but also for all the work that you put in on getting this book to be a reality. We're very grateful. My name is Sigrun. I'm at the University of Oslo here in Norway, and greetings from Ubay, my co-author. He couldn't be here, but he passes on greetings. So before I start talking about this chapter, which is about our analysis of the lead up to the revolution in Sudan, we want to acknowledge the horrors on the ground in Sudan, which have been particularly brutal since April 23, where there is a power struggle between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces, and which has then been driving humanitarian needs in the country ever since. Conservative estimates say that the conflict has killed at least 15,500 people, while some estimates are as high as up to 150,000 and counting. Sudan OCHA reports of 1st of September that Sudan now faces the worst levels of acute food insecurity in its history, with more than half its population in acute hunger. We're talking about 25 million people plus. 8.5 million are facing emergency levels of hunger, and around 800,000 are in catastrophic conditions. 10.5 million people are displaced, above 2 outside, and the rest inside. And I want to mention that my brave co-author, Ubay, who was part of the revolution and the resistance for years in Sudan, has since had to escape to Egypt and is now living there as a refugee away from his country. So that is the horrific backdrop to our talk today. So in this chapter, we focused on a more hopeful phase in Sudan, processes of people's power. So we wanted to understand the revolution better. And scholars have urged psychology to attend more to history, which is also key to understanding the psychology of resistance, we argue. So resistance entails struggles grounded in perceived wrongs in the past and present, and also vying for a better future. So we're here calling for expanding the timeline of resistance that we're looking at. And due to the word limit of the chapter, we chose to focus on the before large-scale collective action here in our chapter. But there are wonderful scholars who have done important work also specifically on the after collective action. So Lois from 2009, Ulug and Akar from 2018, etc. Okay, can I have the next slide, please, Jonna? Thank you. So there was a Sudan revolution, often talked about as the 2018 Sudan revolution. And it's important, I think, for this discussion that the Sudanese people have ousted military regimes twice before, in 1964 and in 1985. So before the revolution, when speaking to Sudanese, they often had this saying that we've done this before. We've overthrown these governments before. We are, a people's power country. We can do this. There was an overtaking of power in 1989 by Omar al-Bashir, and he then stayed in power for almost 30 years until we had this revolution from December 2018. An analysis of resistance in Sudan typically focuses on December 2018 as the starting point, with descriptions of the revolution being very surprising or very sudden or very unexpected. But many Sudanese emphasize the fact that to them it was not surprising because they're emphasizing what came before that led up to this revolution. Can I have the next slide? So this is a quote from Gutta, who said that the 2018-19 revolution was not spontaneous, but rather the climax of the 30 years of resistance against Sudan's dictatorship. We think that this is a good example, the revolution in Sudan, to kind of unpack how history helps psychology understand dynamics of resistance. So we discuss Sudanese perceptions of this resistance as more of a long-term anticipated phenomena rather than this very surprising change. So our point is that attending to what comes before these momentous outbreaks of resistance allows for a better understanding of that resistance. So we therefore in the chapter analyze the build-up to the revolution. Next, please. Here we then emphasize the importance of past resistance. So we're calling for this expanding of the timeline of resistance in research on the psychology of resistance, what came before, yeah? And resistance movements, of course, learn from history, and historical narratives of past resistance do inform their choices. This talks to the stamina of the movement and the historical learning processes, and also the long kind of duration of the resistance, which is more evident when you are tracking these extended lines of the process. And Taylor has a text from 1989 where it is pointed out that these new social movements are often actually not entirely new. In most cases, these are rather born of what came before. So analyzing such kind of longer lines gives us a better understanding of resistance as people are weaving in these narratives of past resistance in choosing current resistance. The last point I want to emphasize from my chapter, if I can have the last slide, please, Jonna, is this aspect of demobilization or tactics from repressive authorities, because importantly, activists learn and draw on past resistance, but repressive regimes also learn from past resistance and adjust their demobilization accordingly. And Sudan has sadly been an example where they have done that rather well in terms of analyzing what has worked before when people have overthrown governments and tried to adjust for that in their tactics. So we see that kind of the communication and learning process on both sides, right? So those resisting are trying to change the way they organize to get around the repressive forces. For example, they had great success setting up neighborhood committees to scatter the activism more, whilst then you can see the repressive forces answering. And a big reason as to why Bashir managed to stay in power for such a long time was because he was also able to learn from history and adjust his repertoire and tactics for such demobilization accordingly. So basically, our key take-home message is that both resistance and repression should be analyzed with the before in mind, and activists should definitely be very aware that repressive regimes are also learning from the past and then adjusting their tactics. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sigrun. And our next little blitz presentation is from Klara Yurstakova, who will also go back in history a bit.
Thank you for introducing me, Joanna. I don't have slides, but the name of my chapter is thankfully on the slide. So it is called The Dynamics of Leadership and Resistance in Repressive Regimes, the Cases of Czechoslovak Socialist Republic and Polish People's Republic. And this work builds upon my PhD, which focused on the Czechoslovak context during the communist regime, which can be roughly traced to 1948 until 1989, when the regime ended in Czechoslovakia. And my co-authors, Dr. Denis Nigber and Dr. Evangelos Dondis, are my PhD supervisors. They're not here today, so I will just try to briefly take you through what was included in the chapter. But similar to Sigrun, I just wanted to also mention at the beginning of this short talk that I was looking at an event and a series of events that happened 30 years ago in Czechoslovakia, which since then split into Czech Republic and Slovakia. But currently, Central Europe countries like Hungary, but also Slovakia, are facing severely repressive governments as well, in a sense that they're trying to deconstruct the cultural institutions. They're firing a lot of people from the police, and they're preventing people from speaking openly. And there's basically just a lot of cleansing happening in these, media positions and cultural institutions at the moment. So I think it's even more timely to remember where this democracy movement started, and that was in 1989 during the Velvet Revolution, when the communist regime in Czechoslovakia ended. And this is obviously taken from a broader context, which is the fall of the Berlin Wall and a lot of changes in Eastern Europe in 1989 and around that time. But obviously each country had a different pathway and a different way of how they fought their own situation in their particular context. So what I looked at in this chapter together with my co-authors is the role of leadership in mobilizing people for resistance and also for overt collective action. And I conducted interviews with leaders of different collective events that happened 30 years ago. So these people are still alive, and they were willing to talk to me about the strategies that they used over time in communist Czechoslovakia in order to create a sense of community between people, and basically how they tackled the different issues of the particular resistance regime over time. And so from these interviews, it became clear that leaders were very much sensitive to the different demobilization strategies that the regime placed upon activists, and they try to sort of respond to these strategies in a dynamic way. So when I conducted these interviews, they mentioned that over those 40 years that the repressive regime in Czechoslovakia existed, there were different phases of how severe the resistance was. So at the beginning, there was a lot of imprisonment and shooting people on the borders if they tried to escape and things like that. So obviously their strategies were much more constrained at the beginning when the regime started. But towards the end of the regime, where they also paid attention to how the Western world was viewing the communist countries, and they tried to be perceived in a more positive way. The leaders saw this as an opportunity to start becoming more visible and to making these groups a bit more visible, because previously they were secretly meeting, and there were underground communities of people, especially from the constrained areas of the society, which was people who were Catholic, so they couldn't really express religion in a public sphere. They couldn't go to church, or they couldn't be seen as being religious. So there was one group of leaders that formed from this underground church community, and then there was another one which was sort of based on former university professors and people who worked in the cultural sphere, so writers, musicians, and so on. And so these groups of people were those who then ended up designing these collective protests in Czechoslovakia towards 1988 and 1989. And a lot of the work in collective action and social psychology looked at leadership from a perspective of leaders being the figures that speak in front of audiences, and there's a lot of analyses of political speeches and so on. But in a repressive regime, there are constraints on whether leaders can be publicly visible, whether they can actually go to streets and speak, or what types of activities they can do in public. And so what the leaders in Czechoslovakia did instead, what they expressed in these interviews, was that they paid attention to performatively making these resistance groups visible in a public space. So they made strategic decisions in terms of how can we get people into the public space, make them visible, show on the street that we exist, without, for example, being openly against the government, or without having speeches or banners that would talk about being anti-government. And so some of these events that I looked at, particularly candlelight demonstration and then the protests during the Velvet Revolution, showed that leaders were creative in terms of coming up with performative events. For example, they would encourage people to sing together, or to shake hands with the policemen, to kind of confuse them, to make it a bit more fun or surprising, in order to show that there are these groups of people, and they don't agree with the way how the government is handling things, how they're repressing culture, and so on. And so instead of speaking, instead of becoming these publicly visible figures that you would typically associate leaders to be, leaders were much less visible, and they encouraged people to bring in symbols. They co-created the movement together with the protesters. They brought in a lot of people from the arts and culture sphere. They brought people from the underground church. And so these protests were not openly anti-government protests, but they contributed towards making people visible and to feel as if they are part of a group. And this is something that hasn't been done before. And what my chapter shows is that leaders from the opposition, similar to leaders of the authoritarian governments, are sensitive to this interplay between, how much can we do things, and how is the government going to restrict us. And so one of the goals of the opposition leaders was to make these public spaces available for the public, and to do certain activities that the government wouldn't be able to say that these are anti-political, anti-government disruptive activities, but instead they were kind of left surprised into how are we supposed to react to this type of street gathering where people are singing or holding lit candles or collectively whispering things or praying, that were not necessarily against the government, but they were still making the people visible in these streets. So that was something that I focused on generally in the chapter, but as Sigrun was saying, over the course of my PhD, I became much more sensitive towards the fact that in order to understand resistance leaders, it is also really important to look at these demobilization strategies and the interplay between these groups. So I definitely kind of see some of these similarities there as well, to better understand the context, the cultural background, why certain people become leaders, what is the history of them, and what are the sort of tools that resonate with people. For example, the cultural resources in a particular country that have meaning and that contributes towards creating this sense of shared identity amongst people. So yeah,
Thank you.
that's generally.
Thank you so much, Clara. All right, now our next presenter is Canan Coşkan, who will be presenting a joint chapter with Helen Ünal, who couldn't be here today.
Hello, and thanks for doing all of this laborious work for us, Johanna and Fuat. This chapter is based on Helen's PhD work, basically, who just defended successfully. So I'm a co-author. We are both working on Kurdish resistance. She's more focusing on resistance dynamics. I'm more focused on power dynamics. And currently, I'm also working on Kurdish diaspora in Belgium. So there were many overlaps in writing this chapter together. When we are speaking about Kurds, Kurds have been suffering of international and internal colonialism in Southwest Asia, and they are divided in four parts of Kurdistan in imposed borders of Turkey, Syria, Iran, and Iraq. And because of political oppression, years and decades and centuries of political oppression, there are many waves of political exiles across the borders toward Europe, toward United States or Canada. So you would see that there are many Kurds mobilizing outside the Southwest Asia, still trying to hang on to the ties with their original group. So we are looking at a transnational resistance as well when we are looking at the Kurdish diaspora in Germany in this chapter. Johanna, next slide, please. Thanks. In this chapter, Helen's major question was, how do you think Kurds should respond to the oppression that Kurds in Turkey face? So we were asking about the meta-perceptions of resistance in diaspora Kurds, basically. And what we have found in overall was an eclecticism of resistance strategies. This means that using multiple strategies and using those strategies simultaneously. This simultaneous issue is important because it is a capacity, and it is a capacity that we argue that is built up throughout the years of resistance. So it accumulates throughout time, throughout the generations, which then makes possible to look at the existing and enduring problems in the movement as well. For instance, for us, the participants were focusing on a third factor, enhancing cohesion, because they are realizing that it is hard to keep up the unity in the four parts, but also across the political alignments among the Kurds. So they emphasized a lot the need for in-group cohesion. And in fact, when we go back to the literature of collective action, we would see that the empowerment issue has a lot to do with the unity, preserving that cohesion as well. Next slide, please. I won't speak about the details of the findings, but I want to draw your attention to more theoretical insights. The first of one is that I think we should talk and think and research more about transnational imaginations in terms of resistance dynamics, diaspora being a case. And that's because neither repression and oppression nor resistance happened narrowly in narrowly imposed international borders. Furthermore, beyond the transnational solidarity networks that recent research started to cover, there are also intragroup dynamics that are spreading around the transnational borders, which means that we may need more diaspora research in terms of resistance and repression dynamics. This also means that, especially among diaspora members, conceptions of resistance may be a bit different, because we are speaking about a diasporic agency, and it is true that when people are politically in exile, they may benefit a bit from more democratic freedom in the countries that they are residing currently, but that's not always the case, especially if you are politically active and the states are collaborating to criminalize you and your movement. So another issue is that diaspora can have a more holistic look at the current situation in terms of resistance, such a bird's eye, because they are having diverse encounters from diverse communities, especially in Europe, for instance, which means that they are easily making comparisons with their own movements and with others' movements. And some forms of resistance can be more prevalent in diaspora, for instance, lobbying in the European Union and creating a material support because they can reach more social security, for instance, are more at the forefront for diaspora Kurds. So the resistance strategies are also changing across diaspora groups and homeland groups. Next slide, please.
Yes, and just a note that we're already beyond the 5 minutes, so maybe you can
Okay,
shorten
we'll
a bit
be quick.
the next slides. Yeah.
Okay.
Where is it though? Sorry. Okay.
The second important point is that Sigrun already tapped onto that, so I won't go into the detail, but we need more research on the historicity and critical consciousness, because when we are looking at the movements, not at specific collective actions, but the resistance movements especially, we realize that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And the long history of resistance creates multiple strategies and also provide ways of connecting different strategies to each other and increasing the capacity of using those strategies simultaneously. And this is because there is an accumulation of cross-generational repertoires and collective memories. And this means that different strategies would be going along both short and long-term goals for the resistance movements. First of all, another issue connected to the historicity is the critical consciousness. And that's because I want to emphasize previously in collective action literature, we have seen a really nice conceptualization called collective self-objectification, which is quite important as a realization of a definition of self, confirming it as a living, acting agent in changing world. But critical consciousness is a bit different from collective self-objectification. It is not only specifically about action, it's also about reflection. It's about critically reflecting on the unequal power relations and their reasons and consequences. So maybe focusing more on critical consciousness can be important in devising emancipatory paths for collective subjective self-objectification. Final slide, please, and I will wrap up quickly. The third added value of our paper, I think, is focus on intragroup processes, because sometimes when we are talking about collective action, we are considering those collective action communities and groups as a homogeneous group. Yet there are intergroup processes, there are subgroups, there are individual differences as well. And that's what we have seen in our data. And those individual differences are always socially embedded. They are embedded in individual socialization. There are individual effects of repression. Interpersonal relationships change across the subgroups. And the familial histories also changes. So all of that is also important to consider. An issue is that resistance also means preserving the in-group cohesion. So when we are talking about intergroup processes, that means that we also need to rethink about the in-group cohesion. So for instance, empowerment and disempowerment processes would project that if there's no unity, the group won't feel being empowered. But equally importantly, lacking unity doesn't always mean disempowerment, because spotting the need for the cohesion is itself an awareness, a critical collective reflexivity. And finally, for emancipatory movements, it's also important to critically reflect, using that critical consciousness to realizing the drawbacks, the societal drawbacks we have in the community, and that needs to be an issue within the group, within the intergroup processes, because it can be easily targeted by the hegemonic powers. So before they target those drawbacks, we should be able to make the transformations, social transformations we need in the group, such as gender-based transformation that we have seen in Kurdish movement itself. Thank you very much, and sorry for surpassing the time a bit.
Just by double the amount, but okay. Thank you, Canan. Now, next we have Tina Montiel, Junex De Los Santos, and Joshua Oyeng with their chapter on gendering democratic resistance to authoritarianism.
Junix
Okay.
will
Yeah.
summarize. Thank you, Junix.
Thank you, Ma'am Tina. Good morning, everyone. Good evening for us in the Philippines. So I'm here to talk about our chapter entitled Gendering Democratic Resistance to Authoritarianism, Leni Robredo's presidential campaign. So this chapter revolves around the 2022 national elections in the Philippines with Leni Robredo's presidential campaign as a case in point. So, women-led democratic movements in repressive contexts confront gendered discourses at the crossroads of authoritarianism and patriarchy. However, the role of gender in resistance to authoritarian populism remains understudied, and moreover, less is known about ways by which women in new democracies resist outside of Western feminist discourse. Um, and through a discursive view of resistance, in this chapter, we examined how a Filipino presidential candidate draws on gender discourses to enact democratic resistance during her electoral campaign. Just a bit of background about Robredo. So she competed against four other major candidates for the top government post, that is the presidency in the Philippines, and her main rival, which is the eventual victor of the political race, was Ferdinand Marcos Jr., whose father ruled the Philippines for 14 dictatorial years under the martial rule from 1972 until 1986. And the three other front-running contenders were also men. In addition, Marcos Jr.'s vice presidential candidate at the time was Sara Duterte, which is the daughter of the previous president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, who is known to be a populist authoritarian leader who is notorious for extrajudicial killings that marked his regime from 2016 up until 2022. So overall, the chapter we asked two questions. How did Leni Robredo employ gendered political discourses during her campaign, given the fraught conditions of the time, and how did gendered political discourse serve to perform democratic resistance? I will be talking about some theoretical insights based on this chapter. On the next slide, please. We have so as authoritarianism and patriarchy have historically been intertwined, our analysis of the Robredo campaign shows how women's democratic resistance can simultaneously respond to gendered and political oppression. So first here we see the intersecting gender and politics in as democratic resistance. So in this chapter, we note how women-led political movements lead gender democratic resistance in their rejection of patriarchal norms that enable authoritarianism, and in turn offer alternative models of political leadership rooted in everyday caring, relations, and collective agency. The next one is situating gendered political resistance in new and hybrid democracies. In highlighting multiple discourses of gendered political resistance, our chapter also observes the resonance with a range of studies that have similarly focused on new and hybrid democracies. Particularly in the Robredo campaign, she employed social constructions that could be connected to more traditional ideas of what it means to be a woman. That is claiming discourses of maternal care. However, in claiming the political legitimacy of her career, Robredo also relies on more cosmopolitan reclamations of gender relations by decentering her identity as a wife. From this point of view, it is also worth situating gendered political resistance within local hierarchies of inequality embedded especially in democratizing societies. So particularly in this chapter, we our study of resistance focused on um, the campaign, which zeroes in on elite and organized electoral form of resistance as opposed to other possibly more everyday forms that intertwine with distinct forms of marginalization, as is found in other chapters of this book. Discursive approaches, however, would be well equipped to extend these insights to how gendered political resistance arises across landscapes of new and hybrid societies and democracies. In the next slide, we have the last theoretical insight on toward new psychologies of gendered resistance. So this chapter draws from disciplines, a range of disciplines to enrich its social psychological perspective on gender resistance. First, we have feminist scholarship that informs a view of gender that goes beyond an essentialist understanding of fixed or intrinsic characteristics among women leaders, and a discursive lens, which likewise operationalizes a constructivist view that sees women's agency in navigating gendered politics while remaining conscious of the role of social structures that enable and constrain such meaning making. Lastly, methodologically, we also relied on a mixed methods approach that incorporated computational tools to draw analytical insights from unstructured naturalistic text data. And on the last slide, we have some practical implications for resistance movements. Um, First, women candidates' family affiliation with politically strong men is not always reducible to a patriarchal subject position. In this case, women's discursive move may be to acknowledge the value of their husband or father and then move on to narratives of self-sufficiency and owning one's strength. Number two, traditional roles of mothering and giving care can be discursively constructed to portray power rather than impotence. We suggest another way to resist patriarchy and authoritarianism simultaneously. So, as mentioned, the traditional roles of mothering can be expanded to political narratives of generously and courageously caring for the whole country. Such social constructions can be vital in resonating with the everyday realities of publics in hybrid regimes where elite performances of cosmopolitan political values may only appeal to a fraction of the population. And finally, we also proposed the activation of a radical love message, and not only in its lexical form, but on a deeper semantic level where radical love discourses uses a language that unites rather than divides, deploys positive rather than negative utterances, understands human care, and deflects rather than reflects social violence. And just as the world has seen repressive politics upon strongmen's divisive, hypermasculine rhetoric, perhaps so too might gendered reversal through negotiations of relationality and solidarity um, contribute to democratic transformations, which is evident in this chapter and also elsewhere, like in other chapters in this book. So that ends my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Junix. Our final chapter presentation is Joshua Oyheng and Tina Montiel on digital resistance, also in the Philippines.
Right. Can you all hear me? Thank you so much, Joanna and Fuad, for organizing this. And hello, I think I'm the last presentation before we
Yes,
do
last
our.
but not least.
I'll do my best to keep the time.
Thank you.
So just to introduce the key ideas of this chapter, I think in the last 20 or so years, we've really seen massive advances in digital technologies, which have in turn changed many things about politics, economics, and culture worldwide. And not least of these changes, we've also seen global innovations in the dynamic between political repression and resistance. So maybe in the early 2010s or so, we saw a general mood of celebration over how social media could be used to democratize communication and facilitate large-scale coordination in social movements. But towards the end of that same decade, we also saw many examples of both domestic and superpower governments learning to weaponize those same tools to monitor public opinion, quash dissent, and disseminate propaganda. So while there has been a lot of academic interest in digital behavior and social processes, we noticed or we found interest in the fact that these processes of repression and resistance were receiving relatively little attention. So in many mainstream studies, for instance, there's a focus on individual digital behavior, which veers away from the wider landscapes and language of violence and power. So it avoids those issues which require collective action and institutional transformation. On the other hand, we also saw many more systemic and legalistic approaches which stood disinterested in everyday agency. So where people and groups use social media in creative ways to counter institutional deadlock. So in our chapter, we specifically try to disentangle but also piece these ideas together. So we propose a socio-ecological understanding of digital repression and resistance, which acknowledges how repressive processes may unfold on the macro scale, while micro and meso processes facilitate resistance on the digital plane. So to tap into today's theme of context and culture informing these dynamics, our chapter explicitly brings in an analysis of how local political and psychological features appropriate and transform these seemingly global technologies and platforms. So for instance, note how Western imaginaries of Russian foreign interference or European legal moves for enhanced top-down social media regulation are really quite incompatible with global South realities where the state itself may be the biggest perpetrator of digital repression. And meanwhile, from a resistance standpoint, we also showcase in this chapter how grassroots campaigns and coalitions bring together local iterations of humor, community, and solidarity, even amidst really tight political constraints. So these various digital practices, which so-called ordinary citizens are able to through these practices, they're able to educate and learn from each other, innovate various modes of evading monitoring and countering state agents, and finally creating shared spaces where they can be free and together, even against the backdrop of a violent digitalized state. So that's our chapter and their key ideas.
Thank you so much, Joshua, also for being so concise. Much appreciated. And so now in a moment, I'll stop sharing the screen so we can all see each other. But before I will show you, we have 3 discussion questions that the authors will address from the perspective of their chapters. And the first cluster of questions, maybe 3 clusters of questions, is about the context that you studied, because clearly we are looking at a range of different contexts across time and across the globe. Each of you talked about how this context is uniquely shaping what we see happening there. And so one question is if we can, try to gather some more generalizable theoretical insights, for example, about the specific dimensions or features of the context, beyond kind of the rich description of how exactly it manifests there, but what are some of the more general theoretical dimensions and features of the context that shape how repression affects resistance, which resistance tactics are chosen, and, more generally, what can we say about the psychology, the theory surrounding the psychology of resistance based on and how resistance tactics shift based on the specific context you studied. All right. Now let's look at each other again, and everyone is invited to come onto the screen with your camera if you would like to show your face. Which of our presenters would like to start? We won't go in any particular order. Not all presenters have to respond to each question, but who has some immediate thoughts they would like to share?
Can you post what you just said on chat so we can see it? The question.
Oh, that is assuming I can, let's see, copy and paste and it's basically about what we can generalize, looking at this contextualized research. Sometimes the question then is, well, is there anything generalizable to other contexts? What are some, general theoretical dimensions of the context that shape which resistance tactics are chosen, how people respond to repression? If we are to build, cumulatively drawing on all of these different contexts towards a theory of resistance and repression, what are some generalizable insights about context specifically that we can gather? Sigrun.
So I think in Sudan, this element of them, sorry, I have a bit of a cold, this element of them really working actively over a longer period of time that wasn't visible, right? People didn't pick up on it because it was something that was kind of underground, this more like everyday resistance, but that they were then able to build on. So loads of people that we were in contact with were saying, well, we couldn't have done it this time around if we hadn't done all of those things kind of in the build up to this. For example, these neighborhood committees that they set up because they saw that when they were protesting in large-scale street protests, it was easy for the police to just face them, arrest them, get the whole process stopped, whilst when they started breaking out into these neighborhood committees, it was easier for them to protest and resist and escape, etc., in their neighborhoods, so that the resistance was also kind of scattered around. They were in their local areas. They had grandma standing on corners, warning them off, etc. And it made it very different for them to organize as well. So that is a clear example in Sudan as to how they needed to shift tactics to kind of face the repression that they were meeting. And again, I think theoretically, it's very interesting to me to see how they're so actively building on what we did before that worked, and how we're now incorporating and growing it to a larger scale when this protest is picking up.
So I guess the more generalizable theoretical insight would be simply to theorize about previous, well, I guess it's narratives and norms of resistance and counter repression tactics, right? Which might inform also a sense of efficacy among the group. It might inform simply what is more salient, what is seen as more normative, what people can easily draw on in terms of a repertoire of cultural tools, maybe, of resistance.
Absolutely. And it also enabled, I think, a larger degree of participation, because it then gave a role to the grandmas who could stand on the corners. It was easier for others than young people to participate because you weren't dependent on running away. So it also expanded the we, so that the we became larger, because in that process, you incorporated more of this other forms of resistance than just protesting in the street.
Mm-hmm. Janan.
Maybe I can draw attention to the fact that it's not always shifts in strategies, but it's also simultaneous use of tactics. So sometimes we see the shift, but sometimes the shift itself is compartmentalized. What I mean is that, especially in historically rooted resistance movements, like for the Kurdish resistance movement, Kurdish liberation movement has been enduring for more than 40 years right now. There's an organizational compartmentalization, so that you use those repertoires simultaneously with different subgroups. So that, for instance, if armed resistance is still seen as important and crucial part of resistance, part of the group will lean onto that. But some other part of the groups, for instance, older people or even younger people who would like to look for other future imaginations, may prefer more cultural resistance tactics. But that doesn't mean that those are disinformed from each other. They are informed with each other and sometimes used simultaneously.
Yes, absolutely. And so I guess the two more general insights there are, first of all, again, not to limit in our studies to one prototypical form of resistance, right? But to ask more broadly, so that we don't then draw wrong conclusions about alleged passivity or lack of resistance in that context. And also to look at the intra-group variations, the intersecting identities that may shape who takes up which tactics. And then maybe finally to not assume that they are mutually exclusive, right? Like sometimes in the literature we see everyday resistance versus overt collective action. Actually, in our next session, we'll also have I think many of you did this in your chapters, and you did as well, Janan, and just talked about it. But Nima Orazani and Ali Timuri, who wrote about the Women Life Freedom movement, also wrote a lot about everyday resistance and how that informed street protest and collective action, and how it's not two mutually exclusive tactics. And I guess it also relates to what Sigrun was just saying about different actors in society having their different role within resistance, and possibly taking up different strategies that still work together. All right.
Thank you. Just to follow
Yeah,
up on that, maybe I would like to ask, what if you were to be given an example or a case of a context that you'd never looked at before, and we were asked, how likely is it that the movement in that context is going to shift tactics or to use tactics simultaneously? What kinds of things would we need to look at in that context to be able to make that prediction? I feel like your chapters have some building blocks towards answering those kinds of questions, and I would like to see, like, if you have some sense of where that answer might go. Yeah, Sigrid.
Okay. I was trying to raise my hand, but I couldn't find the icon.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. I'm thinking of, on one hand, the nature or the intensity of repression, and on the other hand, the nature of the agentic response to that repression. The intensity of the repression can go from militarized to non-militarized, and usually, so that's one, militarized state to a non-militarized state, which allow the militarized would probably give rise to more underground agentic operations, and the non-militarized or the electoral forms would give birth to more street protests and even electoral forms, like producing an opposition party. So I see three levels of agency at the underground, or resistance. The underground, the armed struggle against the state, the street struggle, and then the electoral struggle supporting an opposition party. And the three can exist at the same time, but they would shift in weight as the nature of repression of the state changes dynamically. The state is not, the nature of repression is not linear. It doesn't go from military to non-military. It's circular, military to non-military. And at the same time that it's developing here, there's also a corresponding change in the agentic actions that may arise, and that may both salience and effectiveness. Maybe those are the two features of the agentic action against repression. And maybe those could help bring together the stories of the different chapters. I mean, it could contribute to bringing together them. So what we would be looking for is not really a main effect, but an interaction effect. Not really a description of repression, not really a description of the agentic nature of fighting against repression, but what is the interaction as they vary across history.
Thank you. Sigrun, you had something?
Sorry, Fuad, just to follow up, clarify with Tina. So you're saying that underground, street, and electoral tactics always exist side by side, but the emphasis, like how much we see one or the other, will depend on the degree of militarization and degree of repression in the state?
not deterministically,
Yeah,
but would be affected.
more
But
or less.
I'm not,
Yeah.
yeah, more. It also depends on not only the state but also on the superpower. What do the superpowers? How much would Russia support the underground? How much would the U.S. support elections, etc.? So there are other variables, but one of the variables would be the nature of the repression. And I'm not saying they always exist, all the three. It's like something like cognitive polyphasia, but it's political. They exist. They can exist sometimes together, sometimes not together, but they're there. They're part of the repertoire.
Mm-hmm. And Lucine put an interesting counterexample right away from a different context in the chat. Russia, which is militarized, but the opposition is mostly public with a small underground. So additional factors, I guess, need to be considered where that comes from. Maybe in part also the repertoires people draw on from previous experiences. Maybe Joshua first, because you haven't spoken yet, and then Jenna.
Sure, yeah. Just to maybe offer a variant of what Tina mentioned, no, where the form of resistance varies with the form of repression. I'm thinking of it not so much in terms of the intensity of the repression, but more so in terms of what exactly is being repressed, or what does the repression violate, so to speak. And the resistance becomes a form of perhaps recovering dignity in the face of whatever is being violated. And so from that standpoint, like for example, in the case of digital repression, what's violated is the rights, for instance, to privacy. And so the form of resistance would not be to become overt, like extremely visible, but to find ways of becoming invisible, right? And so that in that kind of setting, a street protest would be the opposite, right? So it because certain forms of repression violate different things. Perhaps that's one of the things to think about when we think about what counts as resistance in those contexts. I mean, I think in perhaps the more standard form of repression that we're thinking about, it's when people come together in the streets, show their solidarity in a physical, broad mass movement sort of situation, then that's when we're studying what has become the standard model of resistance. But perhaps what goes unasked is what exactly is the uh repression violating, and maybe that's something that I'm seeing kind of as a I don't know if it's a psychological factor per se, but maybe it's something that also helps us not necessarily treat street protest as the norm from which we deviate, but ask first what is being violated, and how would resistance recover dignity in the face of that repression.
Absolutely. I think that's
That
really
reminds me of
Mhm.
Reem's chapter,
Yeah, I
actually.
was just gonna say.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead. I mean, it extends it to then counter repression, right? And comes full circle. So maybe you can say a bit more about that, Fuad.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting because in Reem's chapter, Reem and her co-authors, they emphasize specifically how in the Lebanese uprising a few years ago, the movement was specifically responding to those kinds of violations as the authorities tried to shift from one tactic to another. That were trying to undermine either the efficacy of the movement or its solidarity, undermine the identity that was forming, the activist identity that was forming, try to create confusion and doubt to sort of, undermine feelings of outrage. And so they were specifically targeting these kinds of variables that we usually look at when we're looking at collective action. And each tactic was sort of tailored to attack one of these sort of drivers or motivators for collective action. And then the movement was countering by fortifying those motivators by either psychologically or organizationally changing in ways that protected that identity, that protected those emotions, that protected those feelings of efficacy in some way. So that is, I think, a very interesting sort of commonality across these chapters so far, and chapters that we're unfortunately not talking about today as well. Chanan?
I would just add another factor that came to my mind because of the Kurdish resistance context. What would help us to predict those shifts? Well, basically, we can also look at the accumulation and dispossession of existing resources, especially material resources. We rarely take into account the material resources in the resistance movements in psychological models. But I think it's quite important, not only for overt actions, but also for more implicit resistance tactics. For instance, in 2016, when the Turkish government took over the municipalities that were won by the pro-Kurdish party, most of the cultural resistance activities were also banned. So you see, if the municipality was on the pro-Kurdish party, they would organize cultural activities which would enhance the public engagement with those cultural activities. Of course, you can continue to use those cultural resistance strategies in your weddings, for instance, but when it is done in an organizational manner, it's different. And you can do that in an organizational manner when you have resources. So one way of looking through the time is to look at a given point of time, how much resources and in which spaces of the society you have those resources, so that you can see which strategies seem to be more likely in that given point in time.
So we're talking about basically profiles of power distributions.
Exactly.
I want to move to the next question. We could discuss this a lot longer, but we only have 15 more minutes and 2 more questions. So another aspect of context that we don't often see considered in social psychology is culture. We have here a range of different contexts that vary, not just in terms of the degree and type of repression in society, but also the cultural repertoires perhaps that people draw on, and other cultural aspects that shape, for example, emotions, which affective processes are more salient, or how people respond. So do any of you, based on your chapters and the contexts you looked at, saw indications? I think this comes up maybe most strongly in the chapter on gendered resistance with the idea of radical love. It also comes up in Clara's discussion of, symbolism in the Czech protests. But how exactly do you see culture shaping how people respond to repression and how they resist? Would any of you like to speak to that? And again, in also with a not just like the rich description of culture in that context, but also with an eye towards more generalizable theoretical insights about the role of culture and how we consider it as researchers, whether and how.
Lara, you had something?
Yeah, I couldn't find the option to raise my virtual hand, so I raised my actual hand. But I think so. So my chapter not only focuses on Czechoslovakia, but I also came across the case of Poland just to kind of, look for certain patterns that might be similar. And I think that it is definitely possible to generalize the role of culture beyond specific context and beyond these like rich details of each context, because in any regime, or like in a repressive regime, I think it's definitely visible that the regime itself often uses culture as a form of, a tool to spread propaganda, or they have these events where they sort of portray what it is to be part of a nation, whether it's in Russia where culture is used for propaganda. And so I think that theoretically, and all the other discussions also lead to the point that if we want to understand resistance, we need to look at the nature of repression and what is being targeted. And if repressive regimes target culture so much, and they prevent people from expressing freedom through culture. So whether it's, you know, movies or writings or songs or whatever it is, if it's being repressed, then it definitely can also serve as a resource within each of these contexts for the repressive, but also for the resistance movements. And so I think we definitely need to consider it, because if the traditional means of protest or traditional ways of how people would express themselves in political debates or through political parties are being repressed or not recognized so much, culture can be a great resource because people can organize themselves. It leads to a lot of collaboration. A lot of people from the repressed communities can find meaning. And so it also has this psychological value of being able to create something together. And both in Poland and Czechoslovakia, during communism, this was a massive resource for people who existed in these communities before, but then they were repressed. They couldn't officially publish books or produce art or create exhibitions and so on. And so it became a massive resource. And I think it's also reappearing nowadays, certain ways of how people compose songs, or even the fonts they use in protest banners and all these different things, colors, ribbons and things like that are still visible in a lot of the protests and activities nowadays. So I think it also somehow endures over time, and it creates much more meaning for people, and they can build upon these resources. So I think it definitely is something that we can build upon.
If I may add to Clara's and Canon's Canon, how do I say that? Sorry, Canon. You talked about resources, and Clara talked about the power of culture, and it actually, culture by itself, like power, can be neutral, but who holds the power to produce and distribute the cultural tools, that will affect the picture of resistance and repression, and both sides can use it in any way, no? So and in the global south, what is very powerful, I think, is religion as part of the culture. So the state can use the religion scripts and ceremonies, or the resistance can use it. So to address, is culture a feature of context? It's a feature of both the resistance and the resistance and repression. And it may be understood in terms of who holds the power of cultural production. Institutional culture and or informal culture and or digital culture. Culture is, let's say, shared schema. Let's just say tentatively that what we mean by culture is shared schema. Now, who holds that in any way? And that's why in coup d'etats, the first thing they shoot is the media satellites, because that has the power to produce the public mind. So it comes into play. It's very active. If we think of cultural shared schema and dynamic, not static, it can change from day to day as the revolution goes on. Then indeed it's important. It's the subjective aspect of the material power. And then they both interact. And the culture does not by nature bias either the repressor or the resistor. It can be both. It's like a battle for culture.
Thank you. Gustav? You're on mute.
And also just to add that Gustav is another author in the book, chapter 15, I think, on Rwandan resistance during the Rwandan genocide. Gustav, we can't hear you.
I think it's
No,
open
no,
now.
we can. Yeah.
Okay, fine. I want first to thank you, Joanna and Fuad, for your leadership in this project. I will intervene by question rather than an argument on what they are saying. The issue of culture was raised in the literature on collective action by Banzomer. And he was regretting that, in that area, the concept of culture was rather geographical and psychological. That's why I want to ask the question, what did the author consider as, hello?
We can still hear you.
Okay, I was asking the question, what do the author consider as culture as far as the literature on resistance is concerned? Can we talk about a culture of resistance? If there is a culture of resistance, what can be the components? That's my question.
Excellent question. Thank you. Jenna, if you have a...
I raised my hand before Gustav, but it was about his question, so it was so at the appropriate moment, that question. Thank you, Gustav, for making that question obvious. Yes, unfortunately, in collective action research, either it's geographically dichotomized or it is based on the dichotomy of existing cultural differences, and generally it's based on collectivism versus individualism, which is really too much unrealistic abstraction from the cultural complexities of the world. And when we look at I will just talk about the context that I know best. So in Turkey, we are talking about Turkey and North Kurdistan. And most of the cultural psychological research has been conducted by Çiğdem Kağıtçıbaşı, for whom some of you may know. She has that autonomous related model of self. So she's defining agency both in terms of autonomy and relatedness, for instance, but she's mostly working with Turkish temples. She worked with Turkish temples. Even if she worked with Kurdish temples, she never emphasized that. So to which level the Turkish and Kurdish cultures afford collectivism, individualism, or sub-dimensions of agency is still unknown, for instance. That means that we have a lot to discover on the cultural basis of resistance, and we need to better conceptualize what culture means. For instance, Ayşe Üskün has great work on cultures of honor, in which she's trying to disentangle all of those dichotomization. So basically, we need more research on those cultural differences and how cultural resistance can be reconceptualized without only the specific cultural factors such as dance or arts, etc., but in terms of the psychological cultural dimensions.
All right, so it sounds like this is a great topic for someone to write a theoretical review paper, because culture can feature into all of these different levels of resistance. It can be a tool of repression, as we heard from Clara. It can be a resource for resistance, as we heard from Tina and Jana, and it can shape, how people respond to repression specifically, maybe in terms of affective processes, which strategies are favored, and there's this whole topic of culture of resistance in and of itself, right? So yeah, that would be, I hope someone writes that paper. I want to read it. We are coming to the end of the session. We can discuss all of this so much more, and we will have more opportunities. One more quick question before we conclude. Maybe each of the presenters could say even just one word or one sentence on this third question, which is, after having been exposed to a variety of different perspectives and chapters from the book, what is one main insight that you took away that you think this should be part of the psychology of resistance or your own work as a future direction, as something we pay much more attention to, something that we really need to consider in our theorizing about resistance. If each of the panelists could maybe just highlight one concept, finding, or idea. Who would like to start? Sigrun. Yeah, let's go in the order of the presentations. That will make it easier. Sigrun.
Sure, thank you so much. A whole host of things that are super interesting and super relevant, including
No,
things
choose one.
now. But I think for me, this aspect of diving deeper into these repressive tactics and that kind of dance between the repressor side and the activist or resistance side, I think is a lot of potential for us to do much more on that, going much more into depth.
Thank you. Clara.
Yeah, this was something that also struck my interest because I think that from all the stories that I've heard, understanding the longer time perspective and looking at the interplay between how people change the strategies depending on demobilization, and also not just the physical restrictions like people not being able to go to streets or military or something like that, but also the psychological aspects of that. So people being humiliated or ridiculed or all of these different attacks that also happen on this psychological level rather than just the kind of visible things like military on the streets. I think that those are really interesting and important avenues for future.
Mm-hmm. Jana?
For me, it was really stimulating to see how many of the chapters are focusing on many levels or trying to do that systems approach, socio-ecological approach. So it was really stimulating to see across the chapters. There's an effort to focus on the different levels. That was quite important. And also I realized that kind of broader approaches will also try to take into account temporal and spatial dimensions of resistance, which is still quite rare in psychological research. So I'm looking forward to read even more newer research on that as well.
Mm-hmm. And that's Fuad's favorite topic, the multi-level approach and how psychologists can even do that properly methodologically. Actually, you have some methods workshops coming up, Fuad, right?
Yes,
On that question, so.
Hopefully sometime in the new year, in spring,
yeah.
We will have a series of workshops on methods and social change and inertia that will be very relevant, and we'll definitely be promoting that through the listserv and the network. So
with Joshua also, I think, right?
Yeah.
All right, stay tuned for that. So then next is Junix.
Yeah, maybe like what was highlighted in the previous question, like using cultural narratives as tools of resistance. I think like also for the gender chapter, looking at traditional and cosmopolitan discourses and also like gender in general, like the use of motherhood narratives. I think that would be an interesting point to look at, like cultural narratives as tools of resistance. And I think like for that offers like a whole a lot of like directions. And also aside from that, I'm also leaning into like emotions as mobilizing force, like in the chapter that we wrote, also like hope, care, and radical love, like these emotions as force for like social movements. So I think that's also like an interesting point to look at. So
And going beyond anger and the ones that are usually studied. Joshua.
I think if I were to put it in a word, it's the continuity between many diverse forms and tactics of and levels of both repression and resistance. I think, we talk about the different concepts of there being everyday resistance and overt resistance, but I think some of the many of the chapters show how it takes these involvements in everyday forms of resistance to eventually kind of contribute to these collective forms of resistance, and vice versa, how being part of these movements also informs one's own personal kind of situation and navigation of an oppressive thing. So yeah, so continuity amid the diversity of resistance strategies.
Mhm. And also studies that consider how they work together as opposed
Yes.
to either focusing on collective action or on
Mhm.
everyday resistance.
Absolutely, yeah.
Mhm. Tina, would you like to add something?
Okay, everything's good. Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you.
we have your blessings. All right, so as a very final slide that I would like to share with you, we have just some information about what's next. So first of all, we have the second part of this book launch with an additional team of a few authors from the book coming up on Tuesday, September 17th, with the times listed here that will be sent out over our mailing list. You can find recordings, including from this session and previous sessions, on our website, which is here. There you can also sign up for our mailing list to receive all event flyers and registration info and everything else. A link is there, or you can follow this link, the tinyurl.com psych-resistance-series for our mailing list if you are not yet on it. And then finally, we will be continuing the series, the regular series, now going to a monthly pace. First Monday or sometimes another day of the week a month. And the first one in that will be Clara's presentation on a different project on October 1st, I believe, on Tuesday. But we're also looking for new presenters, new session ideas. So there will be a form and a call for, proposals, but you can also just email us anytime you have something that you would like to bring to these series, and we're quite open in terms of formats. We are looking for more innovative formats, not just the standard, talk and Q&A. All right, so that's all for today. Thank you so much for joining us. Fuad, do you have any last words?
Just thank you all, and looking forward to seeing many of you next time. Thank you.
Sorry, where can we get a full version of our chapter? Is it
They're not
good?
giving us, the publisher is not giving it to us. So you can just create your own, I just used like a Microsoft Word copy of my chapter, and then we can put it on ResearchGate or elsewhere. But they're not sending us the PDF with the chapters.
Forever or just for now?
I think
Forever.
forever.
Okay.
But
And I
you will
think-
be getting, as an author, you will be getting a hard copy of the book that they
And I-
are sending out.
And I think you'll have
Okay.
access to the ebook, the full ebook as well.
Hopefully, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but feel free to, share the copyright safe version from Microsoft Word. It's not as pretty as the PDF layout, but it has all the content. So
Okay,
yeah, the
thank you.
publishers are, anyway, that's recorded. I'll say that later. Okay.
All
All
right,
right.
stopping recording.